Now, let's look at ought to. Part 2. Should versus ought to. In meaning, ought to is exactly the same as should. If you can use should in a sentence, you can also use ought to. For example, you can say, you should buy the green one. Or, you ought to buy the green one. You can say, everyone should see that film. Or, everyone ought to see that film. There's no difference in meaning. In both cases, the two sentences with should and ought to have the same meaning. However, there are a couple of differences in how you use ought to. First, ought to is more formal, more old-fashioned, and less common in modern spoken English. That means you probably won't use ought to unless you're writing or you want to sound very formal. Secondly, ought to has a slightly different form. Obviously, you need to add to. Also, the negative form is not generally contracted. So, you can say, you shouldn't have said that. With should not, you can contract it to shouldn't. However, with ought to, you need to use the full form. You ought not to have said that. Again, with ought to, the sentence sounds very formal, and it's unlikely that you would actually say this. With should, you can make questions, like this. What time should I get there? With ought to, you can technically make questions, but they sound ridiculously formal. What time ought I to get there? This sounds really old-fashioned and unnatural, so I advise you that you don't use ought to in this way. So to review, ought to has the same meaning as should, but a different form. It's also more formal and less common.